The story of James City County is the story of the nation. New World and Old coming together to create a place unlike any other.
More people know me by Sam than any other name. That's a nickname my daddy started calling me Sam when I was a little boy. And I went with him everywhere he went, and he always called me Sam. So I grew up right right on the same farm I live on now. I grew up, which is on the Old Stage Road Farm, which is across the road from Stonehouse. People can identify it because it's across the road from Stonehouse.
I grew up in Richmond. My parents moved to Virginia from New England during the First World War. My dad was stationed in Petersburg, and he has always been a good entertainer, and so he was with what was then like the USO at Camp Lee. So he was able to pick up his extra money for school by playing the organ and directing choirs in big churches, because he'd learned how to do that as a little boy. And so he went to Brown University and met my mother, who lived in Providence, and so from there they moved to Virginia. And then he was decided to go to Richmond. He was wooed there by St. James Episcopal Church, which was at that time next to Beth Ahaba Synagogue, and so he played at both those places.
So I grew up during the Depression. Didn't know anything else. Never bothered us because we lived in the country. Other than we did eat potatoes for 3 weeks one time straight because that's all we had. But we didn't know any difference then either. That didn't bother us either. My daddy farmed. His father, of course, he was from a farming family, and my daddy farmed. But as he developed on into not later years, but got to be a working young man, he worked for Mr. C.C. Branch, who was Hammond Branch's daddy, and Mr. Branch had a lot of mules and raised a lot of potatoes. And my dad said, "Mr. Branch, I'm going to buy a truck. We're loading potatoes on the railroad cars at Tawana. I'm going to buy a truck, and I can move more barrels of potatoes on this truck than I can a wagon if you'll give me a job hauling them." And so he bought his first truck, and I don't know what year it was. It was somewhere around 1916, I think, was when he bought his first truck, which of course was a Model T. And I think he hauled like 8 barrels of potatoes on that, maybe 6 to 8 barrels of potatoes on it. And he developed from there on into the trucking business, and that became his main line of business versus farming. He still farmed, but it was more of a sideline thing.
So my mother and dad she was very active in the community, which I realized was important, and I would go with her. My brother was 8 years older than I, and so she was involved in the PTA by then, so I would go with her to the PTA meetings, and I'm still doing that. I fell in love with a guy who was in law school here, and so we moved here while he finished his senior year in law school, and his family was nearby, and a wonderful big family, because my family, being these New Englanders who'd moved south, we just consisted of my mother and father and my brother and myself, and so I was just blessed to find this tremendous bunch of Hornsbys in the area, and so Williamsburg seemed just the right place to start, and we never wanted to leave, because my husband was really active in Williamsburg as well as on the peninsula, having grown up in Seaford and Yorktown. So he went that way, and I sort of migrated toward the Richmond side of things, because I'd go up there to keep up with my family there and be enriched by some good speakers and programs that they had up there. And I also worked up there after we were married, because I had begun modeling, and I didn't want my husband as a law student to have to pay for his own Christmas gifts and things, so I wanted to pick up a little extra money that I could shop with.
I had a car. My father gave me a brand new car when I was 14 years old. I was for Christmas, because I could get a driving permit when I was 14. So I had a new 1941 Chevrolet car when I was 14, and he kept me in automobiles then for a while. I started driving a tractor and trailer when I was 14. I was on the road. I ran the same runs. We had ICC rights for 9 states on the East Coast, and I ran the same runs and the other truck drivers did when I wasn't in school, of course. But I did go to school. I didn't stay out of school to drive a truck, but I drove a truck every summer and on weekends and so forth, and I drove tractors and trailers just like they did.
My first years of working at Matthew Whaley to improve the library, I had a great two cohorts in Stella Nyman and Ella Mae Parker, and we went to the school board to improve the library. And I just realized Ella Mae was from Kansas, Stella was from New England, and they'd had a different experience for education and community support for education. And so they were able to enrich our awareness here locally. Virginia had been kind of slow in that. They had tutors and private schools, but for the public schools, they hadn't really brought their budgets into play in a realistic way. We would go up to a meeting in a little room upstairs over the theater with Rawls Bird, who was the superintendent. Now there's a school name for him. And we'd say, you know, we need teacher salaries to be raised and all these things, because at that time the teachers were just really the old maid sisters who lived at home and didn't need a big salary. But by that time they had changed. Fortunately, I put myself 70 years ago, I guess, but it's important to realize that it's a profession now and not just a pastime for the members of the family who would like to help children read.
I can remember my first day at school. I was scared to death, of course, because I'd never been around any amount of children before. And as I said, see, that'd be 1931. And back then, the roads and everything, the school buses and everything was entirely different. The first school bus that I rode on was a truck with a body built on the back, and it had 2 long seats down each side that we sat on. And because I was kind of small and knew the bus driver, he'd let me sit up in the cab with him, so I rode in the cab, which was a whole lot more comfortable sitting back on that wooden bench on each side, so I did get a chance to ride in the cab most of the time. Then I think the second year, of course, I think we actually got a school bus that actually had a school bus body on it, and Mr. Meadows had that school bus, I believe. And then once I got my driving permit at 14, I became a school bus driver then when I was 14 for Mr. Meadows at that time. But it was entirely different then. You know, we probably didn't have over maybe 20 children on a bus. Maybe the route that came up my way, which is the bus that I drove, probably didn't have over maybe 20. Might have had as many as 25, but most of the time around 20. And children's actions then was entirely different than they are now. I mean, it was a lot of fun, and you never saw fights on the bus or anything like that, I don't believe. Never had any discipline problems. I probably, because some of them were older than I was that I was driving, so I didn't try to discipline them. I think we had a total of 5 buses that served Tawana High School. And all 5 buses were individually owned by somebody. And what they'd do in the summertime, they'd slide this school bus body off, and then they'd use that vehicle as a regular truck on the farm. Like Mr. Meadows, he always dealt in animals and did some farming and raised watermelons and stuff like that. And so they'd always take the school bus body off and use the truck then for something else during the summer.
When I first came here, the city and the county were operating separate systems, and they had just begun to merge, and James Blair had just opened as the high school, and I thought, and I had come through listening to all the discussions about whether they should combine or not, and I thought, well, by the time I have children and they get there, this will all be settled. But it's still going on. I had the merger report on my bedside table, and one of our children had an upset stomach and threw up on it. And we thought, that's no help to the merger report, but maybe that's what it deserves, because at that time it was still very unsettled, as was this child's stomach, but he felt better, and we got a good merger.
My grandmother's name was America. Her brother's name was, one brother was named Christopher Columbus. Her other brother's name was George Washington. So that was a pretty patriotic family, whatever, for whatever reason, I'm not sure. But everybody called her Miss America, but she never entered the Miss, they didn't have that back then when she was a teenager or a young lady. But everybody called her Miss America, but that was my grandmother.
It wasn't, it was just on Duke of Gloucester Street then, and those were the times we could just drive on. We'd go down to the movie or to the drugstore, just park on the street, and the A&P was on the corner where the Kraft House is now, and the Colonial Store, DP, was over where the Christmas shop is, and the drugstore was where the Trellis is, and there was a drugstore on the corner. It was just, I do realize I've seen a lot of wonderful changes, but lost a few things that were kind of made it a neat community too. The police would stand, their corner was there in front of the corner drugstore and by the movie theater, and you could always find them there. A few of them, though I think there were 4 members of the police force, and a couple of them were always there as their shifts changed. We'd go to the Ironbound Inn, or Steve Sakalis, Corner Greek, or the Middle Greek, or across the street. Then Howard Johnson's that came into town, and that's where Ben's is now. That was there. So, but when we lived on Westover Avenue, we just walk over to the Ironbound Inn, which was a little restaurant connected to a group of tourist accommodations. And the Williamsburg Shopping Center was, I guess the Ironbound Inn was right at the end of Westover Avenue and Richmond Road, because we lived on Westover where the Brooks Agency now is. And the Colonial Store, when it moved from Duke of Gloucester Street, built a new store out on where the Food Lion is now. That's that same building. And Nottingham Pharmacy was next door. That was a great community gathering spot for the men, getting their haircuts and their shaves. That's all changed, hasn't it? Well, fortunately, Colonial Williamsburg being the nucleus, I guess, that hasn't changed that much, except the traffic pattern has, and what's in the shops, because the 5 and 10 and Mr. Douglas's bakery was next to the A&P, and that was a great spot for stopping after school on the way home from Matthew Whaley and enjoying the largesse of the baker, Mr. Douglas. The whole Douglas family was very precious in town. And the 5 and 10 was next door to that. So it was the shopping center, not tourist-oriented then, just what the town needed.
I just started working and had trucks. I think about that same time, I believe I had a small scholarship to VPI, and I went up there. I remember my mother and dad and I went up there and met with the old president of the college up there. I can't remember what his name was, but I remember seeing him. He smoked a pipe and had old bushy eyebrows up here. I remember him like that. And we chatted along, and he said, son, I don't believe you're very anxious to come up here. And I said, well, I don't know. They want me to go and start college. So he asked me what I did and so forth. I told him, I said, well, I've gotten back to where I got in 3 trucks again now. And he said, how much money you make? I said, I make about $150 a week clear. He said, that's more money than I make. He said, you don't need college. And I said, you're right. And that's when I got up and left. When I became 21, I did 3 things that day, and that was one of them. I registered to vote, and you had to take a test, oral test, and they asked you a very simple question. I don't remember what. I don't know. It was nothing, but you had to pay a poll tax, $1.50 poll tax. And certainly we had segregation, and segregation was bad back then, and I mean, and it was very, very strong. The segregation was, I remember segregation very, very well because it didn't change till later in my life, of course. And the poll tax and the exam, the test that they was strictly for one thing, and that was to keep African Americans from voting. That's the reason we had it. We didn't have any other reason. You can tell me anything you want to, but that was the only reason we had it. Poll tax was $1.50. And that sounds like not for a simple thing, but there's a lot of people, working people, and the African Americans was mostly farm labor. They didn't have $1.50 to spend on being able to vote. They had to buy groceries with that $1.50. They couldn't do it. And I can remember, I mean, black people had a terrible time, I can tell you. And we had to pay that poll tax. And while our county was pretty lenient regarding as far as any kind of test or anything, but they had to pay, everybody had to pay that poll tax, and it had to be proven before you could vote, whether me, black, white, whatever. You had to prove that you'd pay your poll tax before you could vote. I believe it was 4 things. The other thing is, to be 21, you had to be 21 to belong to the Rotarian Club. I joined the Rotarian Club. You had to be 21 to become a Mason. I joined the Masonic Lodge. You had to be 21 to get a liquor book, and so I got a liquor book because the war was still rationing things then, and so you had to have that. That was the things I really did that day. I accomplished all of those that first day.
I worked with the Shakespeare Festival because I thought that, at that time, my husband was on the Board of Visitors at William and Mary, and Tom Graves, who was the president at the time, asked us, we had gone to England for the summer, and traded houses with a professor here, and gone to see, you know, Shakespeare theater at its best over there. And we, just before we left, they had the first performances at Phi Beta Kappa Hall for the Virginia Shakespeare Festival. And we were so impressed with what they'd done here that when we came back, we said, you know, we've seen the best, and you all really measure up well. So Tom Graves said, well, why don't you then start a support group for the Virginia Shakespeare Festival? So we said fine, because we thought that was something the college could offer in addition to the sports things that everybody loves for the college.
My dad built that house in 1925, which was the year I was born. We moved in it though in 1927. It's when we moved in that house. Prior to that, we lived in a building that my dad built as a barn. We lived in the barn part that he built as a barn, and we didn't have any other place and so forth, so we lived in that barn. And then in 1920, my mama didn't want to move in a new house. She never liked anything new. So every time we got a new car, it never was as good as the old one. So she didn't, but we finally moved to the new house. And so we had an ice box. And we had electricity. Nobody else had electricity. The way we had electricity is that we had what they call a Delco plant. And so we had a line of batteries down there, and we'd start this thing up in the daytime, and they would charge these batteries up. And so then at nighttime, we'd have electric lights. And so then they finally ran a electric line over across the road, even further over than where now Stonehouse is, over in there, the power line there. And my dad paid some kind of money and made some kind of arrangement so that we got tied into that line, and we actually brought current to our house.
And when we moved here, we had several lots and built on 2 lots, and then we were encouraged by our neighbors across the street, the John Lewises, who had this wonderful old house, Bell Farm. It had been bought by Colonial Williamsburg and moved piece by piece, numbered piece by piece, to be reconstructed in town. But it was a farmhouse, and they found that there was no foundation in the town colonial town to support a farmhouse. They were little townhouses.
And so we used a wood stove, of course, to heat our hot water too. We had a hot water tank that would siphon the water through the firebox, and that was how you had your hot water. We probably, I don't know what year we got an electric range. Again, it was one of the first ones. People come see that too. The neighbors come see that electric range. And I can't remember what year we got that thing, but it was after we had current for some time, because even after we got that, she still used that wood stove because the electric range didn't make biscuits near as good as the wood one, so we used the wood range. I still had to bring that blooming wood in until I got 15 years old. Well, the picture that you'll see, this is when my father was in the trucking business, and you'll see that a boxwood is on the truck getting ready to be unloaded. And you'll notice, if you notice the brick wall that's opened up and the brick pillar beside the truck, it's at the governor's mansion in Williamsburg. And we moved those boxwoods in there. And of course, they were tremendous boxwoods. We moved those boxwoods in there from Cumberland County, is where we bought most of them, from Cumberland down there to the governor's mansion and the palace and so forth. And some of those big Marlboro trees out in front of the Capitol, we moved there also.
A good philosophy is to not live here all by yourself, but to be involved and to give as well as take. I think probably the whole summation in my thought is that we're not here by ourselves. There is a cause that, I mean, we didn't give ourselves life. There's a cause of life and love, and those are the things that make life productive.
When you look at the city of Williamsburg, Yorktown, and Jamestown, there ain't no better place in the United States than right here. And there's not any more. I mean, this is a great family town, a great family place, and there's no better place in the world for families to visit to get a feel for what our colonial structure was, I don't think, than that triangle.
I'd like to share the joy I have from watching the world and loving it and not giving up on it. I think we need to look around us and enjoy the good things and try to minimize the negative and figure out how, again, to the ideas that this whole thing, an innovative idea plan, things that we could do to help make it better.